My next guest needs no introduction, but I'm going to give him one anyway. Max Blumenthal is a journalist. He is an author of a number of books, including Goliath and The Management of Savagery. We love to talk to him here on this show and catch up on his latest doings. He's just back from Syria. There's been some debate about that, which we could talk about a little bit. And we'll also see, as with always in our conversations with Max, where it takes us. So without any further ado, Max Blumenthal, welcome back to the Zero Hour.
Good to be back. Good to be back in the swamp.
Welcome back. And of course, by that, you mean Washington, D.C., and not this particular studio.
Well, it's a swampy studio.
We're swamp denizens.
And just one correction, there was no debate about my presence in Syria. It was more like aneurysm.
Oh, okay. Well, first of all, I want to talk about the debate. But most of all, I want to hear about the trip first.
Yeah, that's the more important part.
Yeah.
And the rest is sort of background noise.
Okay.
But I was in Syria, which is in the part of Syria where most Syrians live, which is government-held territory. Most of the country has been retaken by the government from foreign-backed extremists, and I was in the Damascus area. I got to go there with a U.S. delegation of union and labor activists to join union leaders and labor activists and anti-war activists from around the world, from South Africa to Mali to the Czech Republic to Canada, at this conference outside Damascus called the General Trade Union Forum. In Syria, the government pretty much controls all life. I mean, it is a one-party state. Nobody disputes that. I gained access to this area by joining the delegation as a journalist. The Syrian government didn't pay for me to go. It wasn't. I had no contact with the Syrian government in planning the trip. Once I got there, the one trade union of Syria, which is 300,000 workers strong, was presiding over the conference. And so I was harshly attacked for that, but this is the way that I'm going to get access to this area that very few Americans at this point are able to get to. The conference in itself was fascinating. I learned that according to this trade union, 12,000 Syrian workers were killed in the 8-year Proxy war. Civil service workers were targeted because they are representatives of the government, whether they were, repairing rail lines outside the northeastern city of Deir ez-Zor, which was eventually surrounded by ISIS and were slaughtered for doing that, whether they were repairing electrical lines around Aleppo, or they were the postal workers thrown off the roof of the post office by the CIA-backed Free Syrian Army in 2011, near Aleppo. They were killed. I met one hospital worker who had to pass through opposition-held territory on his way to a publicly run hospital, and he said he felt that it was his duty to take care of patients. It was his national duty, and he's walking around on crutches. He's missing his right leg. He had woken up one day in a hospital bed with his right leg missing. It had been amputated after he was hit by a mortar shell. I met the daughter of a electricity company worker whose father was killed in a car bomb. So I got to experience that and to hear from other union leaders about why they had come to Syria to express their solidarity. A union leader from Mali talked about how parts of his country were overrun by Boko Haram, which would not have been possible if it weren't for the U.S. and NATO intervention in Libya, where Gaddafi's arm depots, the Libyan military's arms depots, just basically became opened up to any, Wahhabi fanatic who wanted to take it, and they were basically handed over to groups like Boko Haram, which overran parts of northern Nigeria and Mali. And he said, we're facing the same enemy. So it was fascinating for me to observe. But then after the 2-day conference, I was pretty much free to go with my colleagues. And we went to the old city of Damascus we didn't have any government minders. I mean, we made our own schedule. There was no tour. The government didn't take us on a tour. There was no agenda outside of this conference where I went to like 2 or 3 sessions. And we were in an area in eastern Damascus called Bab Sharki, which is it's amazing. I mean, for any tourist to be able to go to this place would be on the same level as going to Jerusalem for the first time, maybe on a higher level. It's so impressive. This is where Christians fled from Roman persecution, where Saul became St. Paul. It's near the Umayyad Mosque, the great mosque built on this basilica in the 7th century to John the Baptist. It has a memorial. It has a tomb which supposedly contains John the Baptist's head. There's a Shi'a area next to it that contains a shrine to Rokhaya, the daughter of Imam Hussein. There's so much religious diversity just within a few blocks. Ashura, the Shia ceremony, had just taken place, and there were still signs up for the ceremony, as well as signs, supporting the axis of resistance of the Houthis, Iran, and Hezbollah, who the Shia population believes are protecting them in the Middle East from imminent extermination by Sunni jihadist forces like ISIS, sponsored by the Gulf states. So, it's just fascinating to be there. But the area I was in was a Christian area. It has a flourishing bar scene with some of the most interesting, unique bars I've ever visited. And you get outside the gate of this beautiful area of the old city, and then you're just in Damascus proper. And across the highway is, stretching for kilometers and kilometers and kilometers of the eastern suburbs of Damascus, going into Ghouta, Jobar, Ain Tarma, areas that had been occupied for years by the Wahhabi Contras, Jaish al-Islam, the Army of Islam, supported by Saudi Arabia, Jabhat al-Nusra, the al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria, which represents the largest grouping of al-Qaeda since 9/11, the Al-Rahman Brigade, which was sponsored by Qatar. And they'd taken over this entire area and then created their own theocratic mini-states, setting up little Saudi Arabias in just within, you could have launched a mortar from the area they occupied into the Christian quarter. And in fact, I saw the remnants of, or the signs of mortar shells that had hit the Christian area all over the place. And people told me stories of their friends getting hit by mortars and being blown up all over the buildings. But the important thing to note is that these groups were genocidal in their intention. I was accused of, supporting genocide by being there. Genocide tour or whatever. I was actually on a genocide prevention tour because I was telling the story of how these genocidal militias, led by people like Zahran al-Lush, who said that his intention, he openly said this, was to cleanse Syria of religious minorities, were just a few hundred meters away from a thousands-year-old site of Christian and Shia heritage, and they would have ethnically cleansed it and slaughtered everyone, as they did in areas they reached and took over where there were other religious minorities. So I was able to, because I had no government minders, because I was not on a tour, walk into those areas and talk to people who lived under the control, specifically of Jaish al-Islam, for 4 months. And what they described to me was shocking. I mean, just executions in the street for violating theocratic law, stealing food from the people, stealing aid, and then selling it back to them at elevated prices, imposing religious rule on people in a way they had never experienced before, disappearing women, mass rape. At one point, in the final stages of their battle with the government, according to a guy I interviewed who works in a sandwich shop and lived for 4 months under their control, they rounded up 100 or so people and put them in a horse stable and told the government, if you keep attacking us, these people will be killed. And that helped lead to the reconciliation deal, which led to Jaish al-Islam going out in green buses. I'm sure you've seen the green buses. And when they leave, they get to take some of their weapons and go to Idlib, which was kind of like a warehouse for all of the different defeated extremist groups. And it's now the site of the final battle of the Syrian war. And
what you're describing, Max Blumenthal, sounds a lot like mini ISIS states.
They're all the same.
Indistinguishable.
Yeah.
But these are the ISIS clones that our government have supported as opposed to the one that we opposed. Is that accurate?
Specifically on Jaish al-Islam, Eli Lake, the neoconservative pundit who writes for Bloomberg, wrote 2 pieces defending Zahran Aloush and this group, saying because they support, they're going to be friends with Israel. I mean, that was his basis for defending them. And that's pretty shocking. The Atlantic Council published a piece called "The Right Salafis Make All the Difference" by a Syrian opposition lobbyist named Mona Alam, basically saying, you know, Jaish al-Islam deserves our support. And then when they were being routed by the government and finally taken out, a group of academics and pundits who basically comprised a Syrian regime change echo chamber that attacked me for going on this trip published a letter in the New York Review of Books, which is supposed to be this liberal literary journal, calling on the U.S. to basically protect Jaish al-Islam and prevent their ouster. And you know, the people you talk to there told you they'll just tell you how happy they are that they're not living in this mini Saudi Arabia in what one guy described to me as a horror show and an open-air prison. But, you know, the pundits and academics and supporters of the Syrian proxy war over here in the Beltway, the Chicken Hawks, they celebrated this group, and they celebrated many of these groups. Another place I went to just briefly, 60 kilometers outside of Damascus, was a town called Maaloula. It's the only place on earth that I know of where Aramaic is still spoken. And so half of its residents were extras in The Passion of the Christ, because Mel Gibson wanted Aramaic to be the language of Christ to be spoken in his movie. So he had to go there. And it's an amazing hillside town. It has, you know, Virgin Mary overlooking a cliff, and these monasteries that date back to the Byzantine period, to the 5th century. The Virgin Mary had to be replaced along with most of the relics and paintings in the monasteries because they were destroyed by Al-Qaeda's local affiliate, Jabhat al-Nusra, which took over this village between, this is, by the way, is a village where there are Christians and Muslims who've lived for hundreds of years in harmony. And Al-Qaeda comes in, takes over, destroys artifacts, burns parts of these monasteries, and then kidnaps nuns and uses them as collateral for prisoner exchanges. I actually got to interview a nun who was kidnapped. This is, again, the genocidal agenda of the groups that were the leading edge of the proxy war that virtually every foreign policy elite supported in Washington. And if they had succeeded, the only place on earth where Aramaic is spoken, where you can still see the caves where Christians hid from the Romans, all of this history, all of this heritage, along with the kind of pluralistic cultural mosaic that existed where Muslims and Christians got along as neighbors, would have been wiped off the face of the earth. It would have been wiped off the face of the earth. And I just don't understand how telling that story, well, I do understand. By telling that story, I became a real threat because it interrupts the whole narrative of the Syrian proxy war, which is that these people were just out there campaigning for democracy, and then the big bad dictator came in and just started killing them all for fun while he was petting his cat in a, evil bat cave.
You know, and again, we're talking with journalist Max Blumenthal, who's just back from Syria. I mean, I'll hear more, listen to more about the Syria trip. I assume there's more to tell because I find it fascinating, but I am also struck by the response because I really wonder, as I was telling you before we began recording, I was on Capitol Hill yesterday as a journalist, and yet nobody says, maybe they should, but nobody says, Richard Eskow is compromised because he went to a government-funded site to do his reporting.
We're the good guys, so it's all right.
Well, no, of course, that's one piece of it. But if we were to be logically consistent, then I suppose you'd say I was compromised too. So intellectually, I guess I have to say, I understand why you would be attacked for taking this trip. But the emotional reality of it, I'm having difficulty with. How does one actually, not you, but the people attacking you, I don't understand how you perpetuate that culture, live in that culture, look in the mirror, feel okay about yourself. I mean, we supported Al-Qaeda, or what became Al-Qaeda, to get the Russians in the 1980s. Our national security elite in the media and in government has been consistent, and in intelligence has been wrong, if you look at right as being a good human outcome, over and over and over. I don't understand how anyone can be so cynical if it's just about career advancement to say, well, I'm okay trading lives for career advancement, or do they really continue to, you think, to hypnotize themselves into thinking they're supporting the good guys like this group, Jabhat al-Nusra?
Yeah, I just don't think that that the whole echo chamber, which spans academia, the national security state, the think tank world, and corporate media, they have this aura of inviolability, and they've never been confronted with their own bullshit. Their own arguments are easily dismantled, and when you start questioning them, the whole thing falls apart in your hands. But their purpose is to isolate people like me to the point where they never have to confront them. And so you can see that when I'm attacked, it's not on the merits of what I'm saying. No one's kind of trying to challenge me. When they do challenge facts, it's nitpicking around the edges, but never challenging substantial points. But I was called a narcotics addict by CNN's Clarissa Ward, who is the correspondent they've sent in to embed with the armed opposition, including Al-Qaeda. She actually, we exposed her at the Gray Zone for hiring a media propagandist for Al-Qaeda as her fixer for her piece from Aleppo, which wound up winning some big-time award. And, you know, she had to wear a niqab while she was there. I wonder, and then, you know, she gets to wear a elegant evening gown when she accepts her award. But, you know, I wonder how she squares the contradiction of the fact that people before the groups that she embedded with took over did not have to dress that way. And they actually did have Christians, Druze, religious minority groups, Shi'a, in that area. She doesn't. She never has to argue with anyone. It's just, oh, I get to do this propaganda for, you know, the State Department, and then I get my award and everything's fine. And then along comes this guy who all of a sudden starts, you know, interrupting it, and he has an audience and a following. It's very upsetting, I think, for someone like that and their sense of inviolability. And Molly Crabapple, who's this kind of commercial artist in Brooklyn, has the whole hipster aesthetic around her, comes out of the Vice milieu and is a strong anti-communist and imperialist, supports, very rarely says anything about Venezuela or Iran, but was very strongly in support of regime change in Syria. She called me a Nazi and said I was doing Goebbels propaganda. So that's the kind of critique that you get. It's not really an argument. There's not much of a debate. And it's an infantile reaction from people who are just simply aren't used to having to deal with another side. And when they do, they can just typically just dismiss it and say, oh, it's RT, Russian propaganda. And, you know, they'll try to say, oh, Max is like a Russian agent or something, but they can't really back it up. So they run into some problems there. So I think in a lot of ways, the attacks were revealing more of those making them than of anything I was doing. And they were definitely worth the price of the trip, because I got to see just such an incredible place and witness its cultural vibrancy, and talk to people about their struggles. And I should mention that the war is basically over, but a new war is beginning, which is the economic war that the U.S. and its allies are imposing on Syria. They aim to prevent rebuilding. So those eastern suburbs I was talking about, you know, they're just laying in ruins, and the U.S. is threatening companies with secondary sanctions if they come in and rebuild them. Syria experienced a heating oil crisis last winter because of this economic embargo. The hospitals and the medical sector is suffering, which means that children with cancer are struggling to get treatment. People with diabetes, their dialysis is, you know, the dialysis machines are harder and harder to replace. Basically, what people told me is that the sanctions are affecting ordinary people the most vulnerable people. There is a massive brain drain going on, and young men especially are leaving to find opportunities elsewhere. But anyone my age or younger who's educated that I talked to, that I managed to meet, they were kind of a rare find because they tell me, oh, all my friends have left. This is the result of the proxy war, but also the economic war. And one businessman who had no connection to the government said that 2019 was actually the worst year for us. The US pushed a button and tanked our whole economy. So this is what Iran is experiencing as well.
Right.
It's what Venezuela is experiencing. And it's what every country that has attempted to exist outside the US sphere of influence is experiencing. Economic war is the new weapon of choice. It's part of the hybrid warfare that the US and the West are waging on the rest of the world.
And it has a popular, sanctions and economic war have, there's this popular view, I don't know how popular it is, but this widely disseminated view that A, it's targeted, and B, it's more humane. That because of the implication that it doesn't cause the loss of human life. But first of all, it does cause the loss of human life. It does cause damage to infrastructure, right? I mean, you saw, and when infrastructure is damaged, it prevents it from being repaired. The kids, some of those kids or others needing health care are not going to survive this. So what's the follow-up? I guess what I'm wondering from a journalistic perspective is, what's the follow-up? It's not that easy to get into Syria and report on Syria, for example, and what's happening there as a result of the sanctions. So it's hard to bring public awareness to it. And I suppose, anyone who does is going to have trouble publishing what they find. So
well, that's why the gray zone's there.
Okay.
We're not going to get a hearing in mainstream media. You remember in the early 2000s there was some debate. Phil Donahue was on MSNBC. I remember there was even a debate over Palestine at that period during the Second Intifada. There'd just kind of be a back and forth. But right now, corporate media, and especially MSNBC, it's just basically a mighty Wurlitzer for the national security state. That's why I started the Gray Zone, where we can actually report on things that even The Intercept and Democracy Now! Won't talk about anymore, because they've essentially adopted kind of a pro-NATO position. And so that's, we did an interview on the Pushback show that we've launched with Aaron Mate. I was on yesterday with Lee Camp, and, I'm here to talk to you about it. And these are, some of the few platforms we have. But I think, people who follow these shows represent a really growing mass in this country of people who are just hungry to know what's beyond the information war being waged on them. There's been an attempt to socially engineer support for these insane regime change wars for years, and a lot of people are getting sick of it. I think that's what fueled Tulsi Gabbard's candidacy. So I feel like, the trip was definitely a success in that I was able to have contact with a lot of with people I've been writing about for years, and to convey what their experiences were back to my fellow citizens. That's what we're trying to do at the Gray Zone, is to break the media blockade. Now that I'm back here, there are other pressing issues, and it's like every day there's a new fire.
Right.
So I'm going to write a few more pieces about Syria, but then, I have to move on to the next fire. And I mean, there are these arsonists in this city, and we have to be the firefighters. And
Max Blumenthal, it's interesting, and I'm glad you mentioned the Gray Zone and other outlets, including this show. My personal experience has been that it's like I'm sometimes even within the left, I feel like I'm at a dinner party, and I can talk about democratic socialism, and I can talk about the minimum wage, and I can talk about rebuilding the labor movement. But if I bring up foreign policy, sometimes metaphorically, I feel like everyone's moving away from me. Like, what do I have bugs on my face? Or, what exactly is the social faux pas I've committed here? And I'm old enough to dimly remember when I was a kid, a vibrant left that that had as one of its fundamental critiques of the system as it existed, the militaristic foreign policy and the failure to recognize the humanity of other peoples around the world. So I'm just wondering, I'm glad to hear you say, it's my sense too, that there is, you do sense a yearning out there for more information and for more action. Because I sense the yearning too. I'm not sure it's being widely translated into action yet, but hopefully that will come.
No, I mean, we did a rally recently in New York, or I participated in one around the UNGA that aimed to kind of put the issues of sanctions or opposing sanctions and international law and opposing regime change wars on the table. And I spoke about the connection between regime change and the attack on the environment. And we had only a few hundred people came out. That might have been because of hasty planning. But the day before, I think like 250,000 people came out to hear Greta Thunberg, who had like this 16-year-old who arrived like Joan of Arc to New York, and I'd never heard of her before, on some solar-powered boat or something. So that was kind of dismaying. I think that part of the reason that sanctions have become a weapon of choice in this hybrid war is that there are so few political repercussions at home, because as you said, people don't understand that it actually is causing what we can call excess deaths, where the poor and most vulnerable die because they're not able to get medical care, or their social benefits collapse, they don't have food. It also causes, it fuels the migration crisis. And people don't see that. What they saw during the Iraq War, when we had these massive rallies of 500,000 people in New York and Washington, was Americans coming back in body bags or with their legs blown off, and Iraqi civilian casualties that could not be blamed on, the big bad dictator and his allies. And so, to avoid that political cost at home, sanctions are applied, and it's a long-term process. You don't do regime change right away, but actually sanctions will ultimately be, their legacy will ultimately be a massive failure. Not only because they fail to oust the official evildoers, but because they are producing or accelerating the birth of a new world order, where countries that are sanctioned are coming together to form a new alternative economic system, including a new SWIFT system, which Russia is developing alongside China. And Russia and China, which have historically been at each other's throats. Nixon went to China partly to remove it from the Soviet orbit.
What's a SWIFT system?
The SWIFT system is what allows basically countries to make payments. It's just a global payment system.
Okay, sure.
And so, when the U.S. wanted to really tighten the noose on Iran, they prevented it from participating in the SWIFT system. So it becomes impossible for it to make banking payments. And so once you create an alternative SWIFT system and other countries start participating in it, that really takes away one of the most painful things the U.S. can do to countries. And it's just like,
well, and
you're done.
The other aspect of that, if I'm recalling correctly now, is that when the system was originally set up, maybe not immediately, but in the aftermath of 9/11, a lot of requirements, as I recall, were imposed on it regarding intelligence gathering, monitoring of financial flows, large sums, and so on. So when you have an alternative system being created by those other countries, you're actually, good or evil, you're rendering their financial transactions invisible to the eyes that are watching the current system, right?
Right. Yeah, I mean, right now the U.S. has one of the most advanced sanction systems because of all of the mechanisms built in for surveillance. And so they know where all the payments are going. But at the same time, the rest of the world can find a way out of it by developing their own payment system. And the other issue is that the U.S. is simply going too far. Its target list is expanded to the point where it is starting to destroy the economic systems of countries that are not necessarily enemies of the U.S., and to just simply create enemies that wouldn't be there. I wrote about recently the person who is sort of Trump's brain inside the Treasury Department, who is presiding over the economic war on Iran and the whole sanctions agenda. Her name is Sigal Mendelker, and she's a pro-Israel ideologue. She said that, we have to go after Iran because it's threatening our ally Israel. There have been allegations that she is Israeli herself. It's been reported in some Jewish publications and pro-Israel publications. I've never seen any confirmation of it, but she's openly a pro-Israel ideologue of the Likudnik variety. And she has recently applied sanctions on a bank in Lebanon, a major bank in Lebanon called the Jamal Trust, which had been working with the U.S. Embassy and USAID to finance literacy programs in Shia communities in Lebanon, and thereby advancing U.S. soft power. I mean, they did this big ceremony last year with the U.S. consul, Robert White, and photo ops, and then the next thing you know, they're sanctioned just because the CEO is Shia. This is not an enemy of the U.S., and it's devastating the Lebanese economy. So the Lebanese economy is in trouble.
And from a soft power point of view, anytime you paralyze or take out of service somebody that's helping the Shiite population of Lebanon or anywhere else in the Middle East, you're basically leaving space for Hezbollah to continue to be the only organization providing services.
That's why the U.S. was doing it, and that's not going to happen anymore. And they think that they're succeeding against Hezbollah. They think that they have Iran on the run, but the fact is that what they've done is actually harden the position of Hezbollah. So if you listen to Hassan Nasrallah's speeches recently, one of the most significant things he said is that there are no red lines anymore. Any attack on Iran is an attack on us. And Hezbollah has the capacity not only to roast large parts of Israel with rocket fire, but to they have the forward offensive capacity to even take towns in Israel and hold them for a period. They are one of the most advanced fighting forces on earth. And the Israeli leadership does not want that war out of fear. And then you have Iran, which has proxies in 5 countries, or allies in 5 countries. They can pour in more manpower and do way more damage than the U.S. is capable of doing or holding back. It is just unfathomable that the U.S. could actually succeed in a conflict with Iran and its allies. And then you have, Saudi Arabia and the UAE on your side? What constituency do they have? What military do they have? I mean, how many scenes have we witnessed of Saudi mercenaries just fleeing for their lives from well-trained, experienced, battle-hardened Houthi soldiers? So the U.S. is just not in a great position right now, and it's paying the price for its hubris and overreach, whether with sanctions or with its aggression towards Iran, and it's going to create much faster than a more wise regime would have created a completely new world order where these mechanisms of economic warfare no longer bear the same brunt that they used to.
And with profound long-term implications for U.S. hegemony. I don't know if you were in Syria when this happened, when the attack on the Saudi oil fields happened, or were you, or were you able to get a take on that or look into it, or have you been involved with Syria during that time?
Can you remind me of the date?
I don't remember the exact date. It was about 3 weeks ago, I think.
Look, I can tell you, I was in the region, and the reaction was simply that this is one of the most significant attacks on Saudi Arabia, but it wasn't an attack. It was a counterattack by some of the most oppressed people on earth, the Houthis, who have been the target, along with just the Yemeni civilian population, of a war that might actually be genocidal, that certainly created the worst humanitarian catastrophe on earth. And it was an attack on oil fields, which demonstrated something, which is that the Houthis, I mean, the U.S. is trying to blame Iran because they're always trying to turn up the heat on Iran, but the Houthis have the capacity to do great damage to one of the most important nodes of U.S. economic power, not just Saudi economic power, but U.S. economic power, because the U.S. depends on the Saudi petrodollar for its economic hegemony. Oil prices, oil capacity, Saudi oil capacity went down by 50%. Oil prices went up 20%, and this is just a kind of shape of things to come. This is just foreshadowing what the Houthis could do. They only hit an oil facility, though. Maybe 6 people were killed, and the reaction from within U.S. media was kind of laughed at. I think I was in Lebanon at the time, and people were just kind of mocking the reaction in U.S. media as if there was another 9/11 and thousands of people had been killed. Like, oh, let's all pray, and let's all pray and say a mourner's prayer for the Saudi oil well. It's like there's so much sympathy and all these demands from the foreign policy elite for condemnations of this attack on an oil well, when they said nothing about attacks on school buses full of Yemeni children. So in many ways, this was just seen as justice and a very moral way of doing it, by not attacking civilians, but by attacking a part of the Saudi economy.
I understand. All right, well, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. But as always, Max Blumenthal, thanks for coming by, and thanks for your great reporting.
Thanks for having me in.